So now we'll turn to our guest speaker, and I'm very excited to introduce you to Barbara Berenson, the author of Massachusetts and Women Suffrage Movement, Revolutionary Reformers. Ms. Berenson is a graduate of Harvard College and Harvard Law School and retired from position as senior attorney at the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court in 2019. She's a lecturer at Harvard Law School and also serves on the boards of Boston by Foot and the Royall House and Slave Quarters. And I was gifted Barbara's book by an AP history teacher when it first came out in 2018, and I'm very excited to be able to hear Barbara talk about this work.
Thank you. It is a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much to all of you. I am going to now just do the only challenging part of the evening for me, which is to screen share and make sure that it works smoothly. So just bear with me for one moment. And I just need to slide it over from my other monitor. And Julie, if you could just let me know that you can see it fine.
Yep, that's all.
Okay, perfect. Then we are all set to go. Thank you all for coming tonight and inviting me into your homes to hear a discussion about the women's suffrage movement. What I'm going to do today is speak for around 40 minutes or thereabouts. And then, as you heard, I am happy to take questions on anything that I'm able to discuss in this talk or on related topics that you're interested in hearing about. And one thing that I often mention at the end, but since I just thought about it, I'll say it at the beginning, is I have found, as I've been giving many talks on the women's suffrage movement, in addition to questions, which I love to answer, sometimes there are people in attendance who have personal stories they want to tell about a relative who was involved in the women's suffrage movement or later on in the women's liberation movement or the Equal Rights Amendment or various other things. And so certainly I welcome those as well. So what I'm going to do tonight is first explain to you what led me to write a book that focuses on Massachusetts leaders in the nation's women's suffrage movement. And it began with monuments like this. This monument, some of you may have seen it in person, is of course in the United States Capitol. And it depicts three very important leaders of the women's suffrage movement: Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and Lucretia Mott. But it leaves out so many of the other leaders. And most importantly, when you're thinking about the 19th century, as these three women were all mostly involved during then, it leaves out, for example, Lucy Stone of Massachusetts. Similarly, some of you may have seen photos of this new monument that was just unveiled in Central Park in August. And it, of course, depicts Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Sojourner Truth, a formerly enslaved African-American woman. And once again, it's a very focused New York story that is often told. So I decided to write a book that would focus on the role of Massachusetts in the women's suffrage movement, both as its own interesting state story, but really also to look at Massachusetts' role in the national story. It is a fascinating and long story. I wish we had hours and I could walk you through all of it. In a limited period of time, what I'm going to do is focus primarily on the 19th century, on the earlier decades of the women's suffrage movement. And then towards the end, I will just introduce some of the people who would play an important role in the 20th century.
Oh, Barbara, let me just interrupt for a second. We see the title slide, but we didn't see the monument slide.
Do you now see it? So you're not seeing you haven't seen all the slides go by?
We just saw the title slide.
Hold on. How about now?
Yes, now we see the monument in the Capitol.
Okay, I'm so sorry. I don't know what happened, but thank you. Okay, so yes, there was the title. This was the monument at the US Capitol. This is the monument in New York. This is the book cover. And now we're going to begin at what I call the beginning. And right now, are you all seeing a slide that says the women's rights movement began in Massachusetts in the 1830s? Great, okay. Because I do have lots of wonderful images, so thank you for letting me know. So the first challenge, of course, when you're writing about history, as all of you know, is to think about things like, when do you start? You know, how do you pinpoint the beginning of a movement? And of course, it's very difficult to do so. But one of the things I wanted to address in this book is Seneca Falls, because I would imagine, and if we were together in person, I would likely ask a question and ask for a show of hands in response to a question that goes something like this. How many of you have read or heard that the women's suffrage movement began in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848 when Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott called together the first ever convention to talk about women's rights? And I bet every single hand would go up. And it's true, there was an important convention in 1848 at Seneca Falls. But that really begs the question of what led Stanton and Mott to think the time was ripe in 1848 to do something so radical. They didn't just wake up one morning and have this idea. Things must have happened first that led them to believe the time was ripe for such a radical undertaking. And what I argue is that the groundwork was laid here in Massachusetts. And the reason for that, in brief, is that Massachusetts was the nation's leading center of the early abolitionist or anti-slavery movement. There were a number of early abolitionists based here, and perhaps most significantly, William Lloyd Garrison, originally from Newburyport, Massachusetts, but he moved to Boston and established a newspaper called The Liberator in 1831 that was dedicated to the immediate and total eradication of slavery from the entire United States. Garrison was a true radical because in addition to pleading for the end of slavery, which was itself a new and unpopular position at that point in time, he invited women as well as men and Blacks as well as whites to join him in this anti-slavery struggle. And two of the first women who became involved with him were Maria Stewart and Maria Weston Chapman. Maria Stewart was a Black woman, and unfortunately, we have no surviving image of her. But Maria Stewart spoke out against the evils of slavery to audiences of men and women briefly in Boston in 1831 and 1832. She was so severely condemned that she ended up leaving the state and moving to New York and Baltimore for the rest of her life. She left in 1833. Maria Weston Chapman was another one of Garrison's early followers, and Chapman worked with Garrison to organize anti-slavery societies, like little clubs. And essentially, Garrison knew that to build a movement, it wasn't enough just to have a newspaper and writers. You had to actually organize and bring people into groups. And Maria Weston Chapman was charged with helping to form female anti-slavery societies. Because as radical as it was for women to be involved in political work at all, it was really beyond contemplation to think that men and women would work together in these early days in the same society. The reason for that is because back in the 1830s, this was the expectation of women's life. Now, of course, this is an idealized version showing a middle-class woman who certainly isn't worried about where her next meal would come from. But what it shows is what the sphere of woman was supposed to be. Women were supposed to be confined to the domestic sphere, the sphere of the home, taking care of the husband, taking care of the children, taking care of the house. Women were not supposed to be involved in the worlds of business, and certainly not in the world of politics and public affairs. That began to change in Massachusetts due to the efforts of these two women, Angelina and Sarah Grimke. Some of you may have heard of them in part because there was a wonderful historical novel published probably about a decade ago at this point called The Invention of Wings, which is a historically fictitious, but based on a lot of history, retelling of the lives of the Grimke sisters. Sarah and Angelina were very unusual early abolitionists because they were actually from the South. They were born in Charleston, South Carolina. They were the daughters of a wealthy slave-owning family. And due to a series of events, they ended up deciding that slavery was an evil institution that had to be eradicated. They left Charleston, South Carolina. They moved to Philadelphia, and they joined one of these new female anti-slavery societies. This one was led by Lucretia Mott, who was living in Philadelphia. And they read the Liberator newspaper. In 1835, Angelina wrote a very significant letter to William Lloyd Garrison. She praised the work that he was doing and told him that anti-slavery work was a cause worth dying for. Garrison realized how wonderful it would be if he could recruit the Grimke sisters to come and speak out against slavery because they had the perspective of Southerners. Granted, as I said, they were white and wealthy, but nonetheless, they had observed the cruelties of slavery. And remember, this is the mid-1830s. so it's significantly before some of the famous self-emancipated slaves like Frederick Douglass had appeared on the scene. Angelina and Sarah Grimke agreed. They became trained as anti-slavery lecturers. And in the summer of 1837, organized by Maria Weston Chapman, they embarked on a speaking tour of Massachusetts where they were scheduled to go and visit female anti-slavery societies throughout the state to speak about the evils of slavery and to try to encourage women to sign anti-slavery petitions. As they began to speak out, what happened was their talks grew very popular and men began to attend too. Now, men may have come for all sorts of reasons, because they were interested, because they were curious, to make fun of them, for entertainment. But whatever the reasons were, men began to come too. And the fact that men were coming to hear women speak out on a political issue concerned many conservatives, and particularly the then very influential Congregational ministers of Massachusetts. And they wrote a letter that they asked every minister, the leaders wrote a letter, that they asked every minister to read one Sunday in church. And the letter said in part that when a woman assumes the place and tone of a man as a public reformer, her character becomes unnatural and the way is opened for degeneracy and ruin. Very strong words. And what did they mean by degeneracy and ruin? I think they meant something like this: the fear that life as they knew it would be turned topsy-turvy if women participated in public life. And so this cartoon, for example, illustrates that by showing a woman putting on traveling clothes, leaving home in a coach driven by a woman, and it's her husband who was the one who remains at home doing the sewing and taking care of the baby. The Congregational ministers, of course, expected the Grimke sisters to be intimidated, to sit down, to be quiet. I'm sure you know what happens next, which is they did no such thing. They continued to stand behind the podium, but they now also picked up their pens, and they wrote a series of extraordinary public letters that were published in abolitionist newspapers. These letters are wonderful. You can read them online, but I just want to point out to you a couple of their very forward-thinking quotations. So Sarah, for her part, said that there are few things which present greater obstacles to the improvement and elevation of woman to her appropriate sphere, not the domestic sphere, but her appropriate sphere, than laws that she's had no voice in establishing. And Angelina, for her part, said, in part, I contend that woman has just as much right to sit in conventions, conferences, associations, and assemblies as man, just as much right to sit in the presidential chair of the United States. Extraordinary words coming from women in 1837. I also, in this talk, decided to put in some of the lessons learned, since one of the things that I think is so fascinating about the suffrage movement is thinking about what we learned from what they did, both in terms of its interest in analyzing history, but also to where we are in the present. So some of the early lessons of the movement are the importance of speaking truth to power, of challenging the injustices of the status quo, and persisting. And persisting will be a common theme during a movement that, of course, as we'll discuss, took nearly a century. After the Grimke sisters, a number of other women picked up the challenge and began to speak out against the evils of slavery. They included, for example, Abby Kelly Foster from Worcester County, Lucy Stone, also from Worcester County, who we'll talk about more in a moment, and a number of others. We're now going to turn briefly to Seneca Falls, but first I'm going to tell you that what I'm going to argue in this next section is that the organized women's suffrage movement was actually not launched in Seneca Falls, but was actually launched here in Massachusetts in 1850. So first, Seneca Falls. So in 1848, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was from upstate New York originally, although she had spent several years living here in Massachusetts, she and her husband had moved back to Seneca Falls, and she was raising several of her what would ultimately be 7 children. And Lucretia Mott had a sister who lived in Seneca Falls, and she was visiting that summer in July 1848 from Philadelphia. And one day in July, Stanton, Mott's sister, and 2 other women got together, and they talked about the lot of woman and the new spirit that was abroad in the land, the spirit of people who were speaking out in favor of women's rights, like the Grimke sisters, Abby Kelly Foster, and others. And they decided that the time was ripe to call together a convention to discuss this new idea. This was a local convention. They advertised it only in local newspapers, and they gave only 10 days notice. As a site, they were able to get the abolitionist congregation of this Wesleyan Methodist chapel to lend them the space. So as I said, they advertised for 10 days, and remarkably, nearly 300 women and some men came to Seneca Falls to attend this convention. Before the convention, very famously, Elizabeth Cady Stanton drafted a document called the Declaration of Sentiments, in which, using the American Declaration of Independence as a model, she set forth many of the wrongs done to women, similarly to the wrongs done to the colonies by King George, and made a claim for equality, very broadly across many different aspects of life. So for instance, a claim for equal pay, access to higher education, access to the professions, the right to divorce, to custody of children after divorce, and the right to vote. So the Seneca Falls Convention was indeed an important event, but it did not begin a movement. To use modern terms, we would probably call it today a one-off. In other words, people came, they talked, they discussed, they were inspired, and then they went home. And that was very much on Stanton's mind. And just a couple of months later, she was thinking about this and wrote a letter to one of her close friends saying, what should we do? Do you not think we ought to have an agent to travel all over the country and lecture on the subject of women's rights? Lucy Stone, I think, might be engaged for this purpose. That didn't come to pass, but I show you this quotation for two reasons. One is to indicate that there wasn't follow-up from Seneca Falls, and the other is to indicate how famous Lucy Stone had become by 1848. So who was Lucy Stone? As I mentioned, she was born here in Massachusetts, in West Brookfield, which is part of Worcester County. She grew up as a literate farm girl in an abolitionist-minded family. After attending school till about age 16, she became a rural school teacher, which was one of the very few occupations available to women of that era. But she was desperate to continue her education further. And by working hard and saving money, in 1843, at age 25, she was able to travel to Ohio and enter Oberlin College. And if any of you are familiar with Oberlin College, you know that it itself was opened as an experiment, dedicated to educating Blacks as well as whites and women as well as men. So Lucy Stone went there, graduating in 1847. And while she was there, she had a chance to hear a number of important speakers, including William Lloyd Garrison, Abby Kelly Foster, also Frederick Douglass, who by now had appeared on the scene, and others. And when she graduated in 1847, she wanted to devote herself to the cause of the anti-slavery movement. And she became a lecturer for the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society. But she broke new ground because in addition to defending a woman's right to speak out in all of her lectures, she began to deliver wholly separate lectures on the subject of women's rights. So this was, as I said, in 1847. By the spring of 1850, Lucy Stone and her allies in the anti-slavery movement, her female allies who were also interested in women's rights, decided that the time was ripe to call together what they called the first National Women's Rights Convention. Conventions in that era were how one built a movement. The anti-slavery movement was built on, as I said, anti-slavery societies, newspapers, and annual, and semi-annual conventions. They called this convention, before they even held it, the first national one. And both those words are significant. First, because even before they held it, they planned for there to be a second and a third and a fourth. In other words, the beginning of building a movement. National, because they wanted women to come from all the different states. Now, national meant northern, since all of these women were involved in the anti-slavery movement, and the South, which was busy defending slavery, was certainly not interested in a reform like women's rights, and certainly not a reform that was being propelled forward by anti-slavery activists. Why Worcester? It was, of course, the home county of Lucy Stone, but it was also a thriving, important manufacturing city and an important transportation crossroads, both north-south and east-west. They gave 6 months' notice for this convention so that it could be widely publicized and so that people could make travel plans. And really amazingly, 1,000 women, as well as some men, descended upon Worcester for 2 days in October 1850 to attend this convention, to speak out in favor of women's rights. And before they left this convention, they appointed a series of committees and began to make plans for a second convention to be held the following year. Now, it's important to note that who were these women who attended the convention? Most of them were like Lucy Stone, white, literate, native-born, and Protestant, but there were some exceptions even from the outset. For example, Sojourner Truth attended this convention, a name I assume is familiar to most of you. And Sojourner Truth, of course, was a self-emancipated slave from New York. I wish I had time. If we had a lot longer, I would love to walk you through this whole convention decade, because each convention has a new story to tell and brings new participants to it. But as you can see from this slide, conventions were held throughout the 1850s. The second one was also held in Worcester. Then they began traveling around to other important northern states, particularly cities that were centers of anti-abolitionist activity as well. Susan B. Anthony appears on the scene in 1852. Anthony, as you may know, is also from Massachusetts. She was born in Adams, but her family, when she was a little girl, moved to Rochester, New York, where she grew up. She attends the convention held in Syracuse in 1852, and that's when she pledges to then devote the rest of her life to the cause of women's rights. During the 1850s, it is Anthony, Stone, and Stanton who emerge as the trio of leaders at the head of this young women's rights movement. They were friends, they were allies, and in particular, there was a very close and tight friendship between Lucy Stone and Susan B. Anthony, since they traveled around lecturing on the subject of women's rights. Stanton was primarily participating through letter writing because she was largely at home in Seneca Falls, raising her 7 children. Susan B. Anthony, as you may know, never married. Lucy Stone did marry in 1855 and had one child, a daughter, Alice Stone Blackwell, who will become important to our story shortly, who was born in 1857. One of the things that makes writing about, talking about, even thinking about the women's suffrage movement complicated is that you always have to think about what else was going on in American history. And of course, as you all know, the 1850s were the decade in which this nation was creeping closer to civil war over the issue of slavery. And in 1860, when Abraham Lincoln was elected president, Southern states begin to secede, and of course, civil war begins in 1861. I'm going to really pass over this, well, before I get to the Civil War years, what were some of the lessons of these conventions? The importance of organizing, educating, and agitating, steps that are still relevant when one wants to build a social movement. So I'm going to basically skip over the Civil War years in the interest of time and just give you a couple of quick insights into the Civil War years as they connect to the subject of women's rights. The first is that officially, Stanton and Stone and Anthony put the young women's rights movement on hold during the Civil War years so that they could devote all their energy to supporting the Union war effort in whatever ways they could. But nonetheless, the Civil War years were important to women in terms of future advancements because during the Civil War, as has historically been true during all wars in this country, women gained new skills. And these new skills would prove to be very useful to organizing and other efforts after the war. So women, for example, became nurses. They managed homes and farms and businesses while their husbands were away at war. They organized what were called sanitary societies, sewing circles, and other groups to make or gather provisions, and then complicated distribution processes to distribute these provisions to soldiers in the field and in hospitals. And these skills, as I mentioned, would be very important after the war. So now let's turn to after the war. After the war, as you may know, there was enormous focus in Congress on the issue of the ballot. And Congress, for a brief moment of time after the Civil War concluded, remained controlled by the former abolitionists of the Republican Party. And the issue that they were faced with was suffrage for whom? Should it be what was called universal suffrage or suffrage for Black men? Suffrage for Black men is self-explanatory. Universal suffrage was what these women activists wanted. And by universal suffrage, they meant suffrage for all adults, regardless of race and also regardless of gender. And this petition is the sort of petition that they organized to be signed by their supporters. And I know you can't really make out the signatures on the screen, but if you could, you would see that in this particular petition, the first four names are Stanton Anthony Stone and Lucy Stone's sister-in-law. Congress decided, however, that it was, as Wendell Phillips put it, the quote-unquote Negro's hour. In other words, that they were going to pursue suffrage only for Black men and leave women out in the new 14th and 15th Amendments. Why did they do that? That's a long and complicated story also. But the shorthand version is this. There's often been a historical association between bullets and ballots. In other words, if you're willing to put on a uniform and be shot at, that you should get to move to the front of the line when ballots are being handed out. And once Abraham Lincoln permitted African-American men to enlist in the Union Army during the Civil War, they enlisted in great numbers and they fought heroically. So they were deemed to have moved to the front of the line when the issue of ballots was being considered. Also, of course, those in Congress were politicians, and they understood how Black men, both free Black men and the formerly enslaved, were likely to vote. They were going to support the Republican Party as it was then constituted, the party of Abraham Lincoln. They had no such confidence in how women might vote, and they suspected that women's votes would reflect the diverse affiliations across the nation. So they didn't see it as politically advantageous to expend political capital to try to enfranchise women. So they proposed a 14th and 15th Amendment that was limited to the enfranchisement of African-American men. On the heels of that, a schism divided the young women's rights movement that one historian has called the saddest divorce in American history. I think that puts it very well. And the divide was this. Lucy Stone, although very disappointed, of course, that women were left out, nevertheless pledged to support the 15th Amendment. As she put it, woman has an ocean of wrongs too deep for any plummet. And the Negro, too, has an ocean of wrongs that cannot be fathomed. I will be thankful in my soul if anybody can get out of the terrible pit of disenfranchisement. But Stanton and Anthony disagreed. They refused to support the 15th Amendment if women were not included. And they did so in very racist terms. For purposes of public consumption, I put up a relatively benign statement, but the implications are crystal clear. So Stanton, for example, said, "I will not support men of other races making laws for the daughters," and of course she means the white daughters, "of Jefferson, Hancock, and Adams." And on the heels of this disagreement over the 15th Amendment, these former friends become bitter rivals, and they form, the 15th Amendment is adopted, becomes part of the Constitution, and these former allies form competing rival suffrage associations. Anthony and Stanton formed the National Woman Suffrage Association based in New York. They are determined to advocate for a federal amendment to enfranchise women. They begin a short-lived newspaper that's published for 2 years. It's Lucy Stone who founds what I argue is actually the more vital suffrage association, the American Woman Suffrage Association, based in Boston. She comes up with a strategy that turns out to be the successful strategy ultimately. And what Lucy Stone said was, of course we want a federal amendment. That's the end game. How are we going to get there? And she said, the only way we are going to get there is if we take on the labor-intensive, somewhat thankless task of a series of state campaigns seeking to amend state constitutions to enfranchise women. because only then will we have congressmen and senators who are beholden to women voters and state legislatures familiar enough with the issue that they would ratify any proposed women's suffrage amendment. And that turns out to be precisely what happened and why it took so long. She also begins the newspaper that becomes the leading suffrage journal for the next 50 years, from 1870 all the way through 1920, published every single week in Boston, Massachusetts. And she was inclusive. She welcomed Blacks as well as men into the American Woman Suffrage Association. For 20 years, there would be this schism and these two separate associations till ultimately, as we'll discuss in about 5 minutes, there was a reconciliation in 1890. So if everything I have said up to now is true, and I promise you it is, the next question I hope some of you are thinking is, why don't I know that? Why don't I know all about the Women's Journal, the Worcester Convention, Lucy Stone, her strategy, and so forth? And the answer, of course, that's always worth reminding people, is that history is not necessarily what happened. History is the story we are told about what happened. And in my mind, there is no question that the most significant thing that Anthony and Stanton did during these 20 years of schism was write the first 3 volumes of what would ultimately become a 6-volume work called History of Woman Suffrage. And writing during these years of schism, they largely erased Lucy Stone and her allies and the Worcester Convention from the story. They elevated Seneca Falls to the birthplace due to the involvement of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and they essentially wrote a one-sided version of the movement that focused on their approach and their work. Lucy Stone was well aware of the one-sided nature of this and bitterly criticized what they were doing in the pages of the Women's Journal. But unfortunately, she didn't pick up the pen and writing a competing history of the suffrage movement. She felt, among other things, that it was premature to write a history at that point in time. Some of the lessons of all of this is to always consider, and I know this is a well-informed audience where hopefully you do this, but to always consider who has written the history that you're reading, to question the dominant narratives, to consider the biases of the author, and if the circumstances are right, to pick up the pen and write one's own case. So what was the American Woman Suffrage Association busy doing during these 20 years of divide? It established offices on Park Street, just steps from the Massachusetts State House, in a building that sadly no longer survives. Julia Ward Howe had become very famous during the Civil War when she penned the lyrics to Battle Hymn of the Republic. Julia Ward Howe becomes one of Stone's top lieutenants, works with her closely in the American Woman Suffrage Association, and becomes a leader of the Massachusetts Woman Suffrage Association. Since consistent with this state-by-state strategy, one of the things the American Woman Suffrage Association did was recruit leaders to establish state associations. And then these state associations helped to establish local associations in towns across the different states. I told you that Lucy Stone welcomed African Americans into the movement. There were a number of important local African Americans who were involved with her. One particular standout figure is Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, who had been involved in the abolitionist movement previously, joins Lucy Stone in the American Woman Suffrage Association and the Massachusetts Woman Suffrage Association, and later on in 1890 forms a very significant club of African American women called the Woman's Era Club, complete with a newspaper. And Ruffin herself in 1895 calls together in Boston the first ever convention of clubs of African American women. And I will just say, and we can talk more about this later on, that African American women were involved with the suffrage movement all the way through, but because they were also focused on issues of race as well as issues of gender, to some extent they were on a parallel but connected track. Sometimes they were welcomed into the suffrage movement by people like Lucy Stone, and very often, and we'll talk again more about this later, they were not welcomed by people who were either racist themselves or were very aware of accommodations that they thought they would need to make to gain Southern support for a woman's suffrage amendment. I told you that we always had to think about what else was going on in American history. These years of divide were very difficult years for progress on the suffrage front. And one of the reasons for that is that the reformist era of the abolitionist era and the Civil War quickly gives way to the Gilded Age after the Civil War. The Republican Party ceases to be a party of reform and becomes a party of robber barons and wealthy industrialists who are very wedded to preserving and maintaining the status quo. The Democratic Party, meanwhile, in the North becomes the party of the working class, the party that does welcome immigrants to it. But many of these immigrants, whether they were Irish Catholics, Italian Catholics, Eastern European Jews, or others, themselves come from patriarchal or traditional societies and were not interested in a reform like women's rights. And the leadership of the Democratic Party was not interested in a reform that had had its origins in the hated Republican Party. So what was going on politically made progress very difficult. In addition, there was a backlash of new conservatism after the Civil War, broadly speaking, reflected in statements like this. So here we have a Harvard Medical School professor speaking out against women's rights, using the language of science, and claiming that if too much blood and energy is sent to a woman's brain, that would decrease the necessary supply of blood and energy to reproductive organs. Cartoons like this were popular. This is similar to the cartoon I showed you at the outset, slightly more modern clothing. And you can see here again, the fear of what it would mean if women could vote, that home life as it was would be turned topsy-turvy, that men would be displaced as head of the household. Lucy Stone and her allies were ever inventive. And what they did when they realized how difficult it would be, and they had many failures in this attempting this state-by-state strategy, they came up with a strategy of what they called partial suffrage. In other words, the hope that they would try to be able to get their foot in the door and gain suffrage a little bit, and that once they had their foot in the door, maybe they would be able to proceed step by step. So one attempt that was made in many states was to try to persuade legislatures to let women vote for school committee elections. And that was not that difficult to sell in many states because, of course, there was nothing more closely connected in political life to a woman's traditional role in raising children as school committee and education. And in 1879, for example, the women of Massachusetts were permitted to vote in school committee elections. Suffragists hoped that they would then be able to translate that success, as I mentioned, to women being able to vote in things like city and town elections, but that didn't happen, at least not here in Massachusetts. There were, however, some real successes, and they were actually far away in the West, pointing out once again the brilliance of the American Woman Suffrage Association's state-by-state strategy. So the first 4 states that enfranchised women were Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, and Idaho. Why these states? Needless to say, each territory and then state has its own unique story, but there were certain things they all had in common. And most fundamentally, they wanted to encourage women settlers to come. They had a lot of respect for the women who traveled out in wagon trains and so forth, who cleared the land and worked side by side them in building towns and settlements. And also, they didn't have wealthy conservative institutions that wanted to preserve the status quo. They didn't have banks and factories, universities like Harvard, and other conservative institutions that were very dominant and powerful. So the West is actually where women's suffrage takes root, despite the fact that the ideas for it originated in the East. In 1890, as I mentioned, these 2 rival associations reconciled. And this reconciliation was not their idea. It was actually pushed forward by the next generation of suffragists who realized how difficult and slow progress was and who felt that younger women had no patience for 2 competing rival associations when the basis for the rivalry was 20 years in the past. Alice Stone Blackwell was among the leaders of the younger women who wanted to push for a reconciliation. And in 1890, that happened, and the new organization was called the National American Woman Suffrage Association. Lucy Stone, however, is never very active after that because she dies just a few years later of cancer. Stanton, who never really cared much for running organizations, goes off to England for a period of time to live with one of her daughters. And it's Anthony, who was a great organizer, who takes the helm of the new National American Woman Suffrage Association and leads it from 1890 to 1900 when she retires. Anthony herself lives until 1906, so into the 20th century. Some of the lessons of this tough period for the women's suffrage movement: the importance of tailoring strategies when it's necessary, of being able to pivot, be creative, be resourceful. Once again, the importance of persisting no matter what difficulties you face, and the ability to have confidence inside, to never give up, the belief that if your cause is just, that justice will ultimately prevail. So I'm really just going to have time to very briefly introduce to you a few leaders of the 20th century. To really talk separately about the 20th century would be at least another hour, if not longer. And certainly I urge you to read my book or other books that will tell you more about it. But what I am going to do is just introduce some of the people from Massachusetts who would make such a difference in the next 20 years. First of all, just to lay the groundwork, as I said, once again, you have to think about what else was going on in American history. And by the turn of the 20th century, the conservative Gilded Age gives way to the progressive era. And as you all know from the name progressive era that has the word progress in it, this is a reformist era when even if people disagreed over the tactics, there was a widespread agreement that the nation had somehow to address the challenges of overcrowded cities, unsafe factories, government corruption, and so forth. It's very important to keep in mind, of course, that this is also an era when the Jim Crow laws in the South and racism in the North were alive and well. And it was also an era of nativism, xenophobia, and racism. Many new things were happening outside of political life that would make a big difference to women's ability to advance. So inventions like the bicycle, which offered women a chance to get around independently, led to clothing reforms, led women to get exercise. New inventions like the telephone that led to numerous new employment opportunities for women. The typewriter was, of course, another one. Department stores is another one. Very few women compared to men were still able to get a higher education, but by this point, a number of women's schools, including the Seven Sisters like Smith, had all opened. In addition, more women were completing high school. So who were some of the new leaders? I need to start with Carrie Chapman Catt, despite the fact that she does not have Massachusetts roots. And the reason is that Carrie Chapman Catt, who was a brilliant organizer and brilliant fundraiser, and in this short talk tonight, I really haven't had a chance to go into money raising, which of course is also an important part of any movement. But Carrie Chapman Catt succeeds Susan B. Anthony in 1900 and would prove to be a brilliant leader of the National American Woman Suffrage Association over the next 20 years. One of her top assistants was Maud Wood Park, who had gone to Radcliffe College, graduating in 1898, and was quite disappointed when she was at college that many of her privileged, well-educated classmates seemed apathetic about the subject of women's suffrage. And when she graduated, she and a like-minded classmate founded a new organization that they called the College Equal Suffrage League to attract college graduates and college students to talk about issues and to persuade them to support and others to support the cause of women's suffrage. She was so successful in doing that Carrie Chapman Catt asked Maud Wood Park to establish similar organizations all across the country, which she did. Maud Wood Park would later go on to become the lead lobbyist in Washington, D.C. on behalf of the National American Woman Suffrage Association for what becomes the 19th Amendment. And she was so successful and such a leader that in 1920, she was honored by being chosen the first national president of the new League of Women Voters. Florence Luscomb is another very important woman. I'm able only to cover a handful here. Florence Luscomb was also privileged, had gone to college, had attended MIT actually, was trained as an architect. And Florence Luscomb believed, while it was great to talk to like-minded people, to have talks where people who already agreed with you would come and learn more and be inspired, she said that what was necessary was to take the movement out of the parlors and into the streets. So she was one of the proponents of pictures I'm sure you're familiar with, of parades, of bringing the movement out into the streets, women speaking on soapboxes in town greens, at beaches, outside factory gates, on street corners, and parading through the streets. Mary Kenney O'Sullivan, not originally from Massachusetts, but moves here, and she becomes one of the founders of an organization called the Women's Trade Union League to help organize women factory workers into trade unions. And she believes that in order for women factory workers to gain rights, the ballot is necessary. And so she helps to persuade working women to support the suffrage movement, and helps to support organizations, labor unions of men to support women's suffrage by persuading them that women are more likely to be sympathetic to their plight of too many hours and too low wages and so forth. So very important, the building of this cross-class alliance to bring working women into the women's suffrage movement. Whoops. The movement, as I said, some individual people welcomed African Americans into it, but it was by and large, particularly at the leadership ranks, very much a white movement. And this cartoon's a little hard to read, but what you can see are an African American woman and a white woman both holding up signs that say votes for women. But the white woman is pushing away the African American woman. And the caption, of course, reads, "Just like the men." Why was the movement so restricted to whites in leadership? There were a number of different reasons. Of course, many of these women themselves were racist, but also they were very aware politically that if there were to be a federal amendment at some point, they were going to need the support of 2/3 of the members of the House of Representatives and 2/3 of the Senate, and then followed by that, ratification by 3/4 of the states. And they recognized that to succeed, they were going to need some Southern support. And so they were willing to make a racist accommodation in the attempt to seek Southern support. There were, however, as I said, African-American women involved throughout, including many from Massachusetts. Just to introduce a couple of them to you, Florida Ruffin Ridley, who's Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin's daughter, Mariah Baldwin. They were both school teachers, were very leaders in the African-American suffrage movement here in Massachusetts. And actually, each of them is honored by having a school named after them. The Mariah Baldwin School is located in Cambridge, and the Florida Ruffin Ridley School is located in Brookline, Massachusetts. Another very important person, not from Massachusetts, but I didn't want to leave out of the story, a name I trust you're familiar with, is Alice Paul. And Alice Paul spins off from the National American Woman Suffrage Association in about 1915, a new organization called the National Woman's Party, a small militant group that is dedicated to what they call deeds, not words. In other words, these are a group of young, well-educated women who are frustrated by what they saw as the patient persistence of Carrie Chapman Catt and Maud Wood Park and others in NAWSA, the National American Woman Suffrage Association. And Alice Paul and her allies are the ones who do things like picket in front of the White House. They, of course, are then arrested and engage in hunger strikes when they're not treated as political prisoners. So all of these things are unfolding in the early part of the 20th century. For this talk, I probably should have added a slide showing Calvin Coolidge, because of course, one of the things that also happened in the early 20th century is that politicians slowly, but gradually more and more, finally are persuaded to jump on the bandwagon in support of women's suffrage. So really what I haven't had time to do here is to walk you through the story in any detail, but hopefully I have whet your appetite to learn more or to ask about it if you wish during the Q&A. So just to end, what are some of the importance as you start to think about the lessons of the 20th century? The importance always of alliances, of figuring out who you might ally with. The importance of money, of having a varied repertoire of strategies and tactics. You know, it's interesting, Carrie Chapman Catt thought that what Alice Paul was doing by picketing was a terrible disservice to the movement. And Alice Paul, as you heard, very much criticized the lobbying, the persuasion of the National American Woman Suffrage Association. Looking back 100 years later, we know how critical both strategies were. It's also very important to keep in mind the limitations, however, of the suffrage movement. It was focused on gender and gender alone. To use a modern term, there was no intersectionality. They were not seeking racial justice along with gender justice, for example. So just to conclude and to leave you with a few words about the 19th Amendment. The 19th Amendment, ratified in 1920, was a very important milestone and democratizing event in American history. But I always like to say you have to think of it as a comma or a semicolon and not a period. Because of course it did not enfranchise all women. Some were left out. No sooner was the 19th Amendment adopted than African American women in the South were immediately stripped of their right to vote by the same laws that had stripped African American men of their right to vote. And other women also remained disenfranchised after 1920. Native Americans, for example, Asian Americans, immigrants who were not allowed to become naturalized citizens. And of course, as we sit here today in 2020, I don't need to remind any of you how contested the issue of access to the ballot and the right to vote remains today in American society. But the 19th Amendment, despite that, as I said, is a very important, worthy of celebration and commemorating milestone achievement in American history. So I am going to stop there and turn it over to Julie for questions and comments from all of you. And I look forward to hearing from you.
Great. Thank you, Barbara, for this fabulous talk and overview of suffrage. I guess I'll start with the first question before I open it up to people. You could put questions in the chat, or we can also have you virtually or physically raise your hand and ask your own question. But my question as an archivist is, what was your favorite or most inspiring primary source that you came across in the research process?
You know, I'm not even sure how I would begin to go about that because among other things, I've been very fortunate in that I've been teaching a course on the Woman Suffrage Movement at Tufts University. And in that course with undergraduates, we use only primary sources throughout the semester. And so we are using so many letters and documents and pamphlets and cartoons. So I think what I'll do instead of answering that is tell you about my favorite places to do some of the primary source research. And I did the bulk of my research, besides what I did online, in 3 Massachusetts libraries. The library at Smith College, the Sophia Smith collection, has wonderful primary sources celebrating many suffragists. Schlesinger Library at Radcliffe, of course. And I didn't get to talk tonight about the anti-suffragists, male and female, who are also a big important force to be reckoned with. And if you're familiar, for instance, with the role of Phyllis Schlafly in defeating the Equal Rights Amendment, you know how powerful the antis can be. And the anti-suffragists were very, very powerful. Many of the leading anti-suffragists, both male and female, were part of what we would call today the Boston Brahmin leaders of Massachusetts. And so many of their records are housed, not surprisingly, at the Massachusetts Historical Society. So I had wonderful times at many other libraries as well, but those were the 3 that I relied on most heavily.
Great. And I saw you mentioned Smith, and we have a Smith librarian on here who was cheering.
Oh, great.
Yeah, so, sort of as the Calvin Coolidge archivist too, I just have to mention a couple of Coolidge quotes in here. And in his autobiography, Coolidge mentions his early support for women's suffrage. So in the House of Representatives in 1905, you have young Coolidge supporting women's suffrage, as well as a resolution calling for direct election of our US senators. He does say, you know, it doesn't pass. The conservatives in his party don't push for it, but eventually he does see it pass. And in 1930, in a newspaper column talking about voting and the 10th anniversary of women voting, he says, "Nothing can be safer for the Commonwealth than the informed judgment of the mothers of the land." And so, you know, and sort of pushing his support was really that the mothers were going to vote and were the future educators.
Thank you for saying that. I guess two quick comments related to Calvin Coolidge specifically, and more generally to the statements. So the first is that the Republican Party in Massachusetts, and the reason why ultimately Massachusetts did ratify the 19th Amendment, even though the women of Massachusetts were never enfranchised except for school committee prior to that, is because the Republican Party and the Democratic Party gradually came to embrace women's suffrage. But there always remained opponents in both parties. So there was always the conservative right wing of each political party. But Calvin Coolidge, as far as early as 1905, was part of the reformist wing of the Republican Party. Another important thing about your comment when he talks about women as homemakers and mothers that I didn't have time to go into adequately tonight is the many different strategies that the suffragists used in the 20th century to try to gain support from men. Remember, the only people who were going to vote in each state and in Congress on whether or not to enfranchise women were men. And so early on, the suffragists had appealed to their sense of fairness, of natural rights, and so forth. They continued that argument, but they also embraced a more what we would call conservative argument, an argument that we're raising your children. You know, don't you want us as mothers to be able to, you know, have our point of view as the mothers of future citizens? And in addition, who better than mothers to care about things like the quality of streets and parks and playgrounds and fresh milk and so forth? So that argument about mothers is part of how more conservative men were persuaded to support women's suffrage.
Great, thank you. And I think Bill has a question up for you.
Yeah, I noticed you mentioned how Native Americans, among other groups, are not really part of the suffrage movement.
I'm having a little bit of trouble hearing you. I don't know if anybody else is, but.
Can folks hear me now?
A little bit, but if I have trouble, if somebody else can, they can always repeat it.
Let me try something else here. Is this any better?
A little better.
Okay. I know a little bit about Native American women getting involved in suffrage after the 19th Amendment is ratified in the Coolidge years, and that there were some dispute amongst Native Americans whether to pursue suffrage because it gone to issues of assimilation. And Coolidge passes the Native American Citizenship Act, which was a step towards suffrage, which some thought was too paternalistic an approach with Native Americans. I'm just curious if in any of your research you got into that phase of the suffrage movement and Native American women's role in that.
I certainly got into it. It's not an area where I have this kind of expertise is what I focused on in the book. But a lot of what you said is absolutely accurate. In 1924, an act was passed that would allow Native Americans to vote, although that's somewhat overstating the case since many states still had various restrictions on Native Americans' ability to vote up until the 1960s, until the 1965 Voting Rights Act. But at a national level, 1924 was a milestone. But as you said, there were many in the Native American community who weren't at all sure that supporting that act was beneficial, since that act came with pressure to assimilate as well. And this was, of course, an early part of the rise of the separatist movement among Native Americans. So it was a complicated, contentious issue. but Native Americans across the board in this country did not have full access to the ballot until 1965. And then, of course, if you've been following some of the state-by-state issues over the last few years, you know that there are issues of voting disenfranchisement going on right now involving Native American reservations where, for example, people don't have the kind of precise street address that some states are requiring. So that remains a politically fraught issue today.
Thank you.
Do we have anybody else with questions? I know we have one person on the phone, so I don't know if JR has any questions.
Hey, Julie, yes. JR here.
Yes,
Hello?
any questions for Barb? Yes, we can hear you. Any
Well,
questions?
I don't have any questions, but I think that was a very informative talk, and I think it was presented very well, and I think it's a good background sort of thing, both because of the centennial year of the Woman Suffrage Amendment and the fact that we are obviously very concerned about voting issues right now. So I thank Barbara for that.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I think Kathleen has a question for you.
Yes. Hello, Barbara. I'm sorry. We tried so hard to get you in March for our first panel of the Mass Humanities Vote program at Forbes, but I'm so glad you got to be here now. And as somebody who has written about Mary Kenney O'Sullivan, I was so happy to see that you included her in your talk tonight. And I just wondered if you might say a little bit more about women and working class women in Boston and the suffrage movement and the tensions, because there were those, but there was an active working class women's union movement in Boston that tried to ally with the more mainstream women's suffrage movement. So I wondered what your thoughts were on that.
So, of course, to really answer that would, it would be a very lengthy answer. In brief, the women's suffrage movement, as I mentioned, the earlier participants were mostly, white, middle class, literate, and really didn't have a lot in common with working class women, many of whom, of course, were immigrants. Gradually, alliances were formed for a number of different reasons. One is that some women who worked their way up in the suffrage movement, often they were second or even third generation Irish Catholic, for instance, so the children of the earliest waves of immigrants, helped to bridge some of the cultural gaps. Leaders themselves in the suffrage movement came to understand that they needed support from working class women, that they had to expand, and that they would need the votes and the support of working class men. So there was pressure on the part of the suffragists to form alliances with the working class. And some of the working class women, like Mary Kenney O'Sullivan, recognized that it wasn't enough just to talk about factory conditions and the need for women to organize and form labor unions, that without the ballot, they were never going to be able to vote to have those rights. So there was pressure on that side. In Massachusetts, I think things unfolded better than in a number of other states, because we had, thanks to the early women's industrial trade union league, is that what it was called? I can't remember, the Harriet Clisby, back in the 1870s and 1880s.
Oh, yes.
And the settlement houses and so forth, you had already exposure between the middle class or even upper class woman and some of the working class women. So they had begun to work together, even if there wasn't necessarily always good understanding. The other thing that, of course, happened in American history is that the term of whiteness became more expansive. In other words, white came to include the Irish, the Jewish, the Italians, and so forth, even, of course, as it continued to leave out African Americans. So the notion of who could be a woman involved in the suffrage movement did become more expansive. And there were a number of very important leaders from the working class in Massachusetts, besides Mary Kenney O'Sullivan. One of my personal favorites is a woman named Margaret Foley, who was just outstandingly active and wonderful. Probably the local leading Jewish suffragist was Jenny Leutman Barron, and there are a great many others.
Yeah, it was the Women's Educational and Industrial Union.
That's right, Harriet Clisby. Yeah.
That's okay.
Too many words in one.
But yes, they were instrumental as well as once Kenney O'Sullivan and others founded the WTUL in 1903. She would be really one of the leaders who would propel that organization into advocating for women's suffrage as part of their, seeking protective legislation. And
right. But, but class tensions remained throughout.
Oh, yes. Always. Class and race. It was always that. But thank you. I'm so glad that you were able to, be here, come to Forbes eventually, because
March seems
hard to get you there in March, and then we wound up canceling or postponing because of the pandemic. So thank you so much. I enjoyed your book.
Do we have any other questions for Barbara? I don't see any in the chat, but feel free to raise your hand or unmute yourself and ask a question.
Well, thank you for having me. It was great to be here, and hopefully you found it interesting, and thank you.
Great, thank you so much. And for those of you here, we have one hand raised here. Oh, I see a virtual hand. Susan. Go ahead.
That was a clapping hand.
Oh, a clapping hand. Oh, sorry. I just, all of a sudden I saw a wave and I was like,
No.
oh, great. Okay. So we did record tonight's program. We'll get that recording together. It'll be emailed out to registrants. It'll also be on our YouTube channel. So if you have any friends who missed out on tonight, and you can share that with. And then we do just need a motion from our committee to adjourn our annual meeting for this evening.
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
Great. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Barbara.